The phone rang at exactly 9:37 p.m., and I almost didn't answer it. I was neck-deep in a backlog of emails for work, trying to play catch-up after a brutal day. But something about the persistent buzz gnawed at me. Maybe it was intuition or just the quiet unease I'd been feeling lately. Either way, I swiped to answer, and my world tilted off its axis. "Hey, you bastard," the deep, smug voice drawled, his tone laced with the kind of arrogance that could make your skin crawl. "Your kids will soon be calling me daddy, and your wife is catering to my every whim." For a second, I didn't process it. The words hung in the air, absurd and surreal. "What the hell did you just say?" My voice was low, dangerously calm, though my hands were already trembling. "You heard me. Rachel's with me now." "She's done with you," the man said, a cocky laugh echoing on the line. "And trust me, she's enjoying every minute of it." Rachel. My wife. The woman who kissed me goodbye that very morning, telling me she couldn't wait for our weekend getaway. The same woman who sent me a text not even an hour ago, saying she was stuck in a late meeting. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles white. Who the hell is this? "The guy who's giving her what you can't," he sneered. "But don't worry, I'll make a great stepdad." The call ended before I could say another word, leaving me staring at the screen, heart pounding. I redialed Rachel's number immediately. It went straight to voicemail. Again. And again. My mind raced, replaying every interaction from the past few weeks. The sudden late-night work obligations. The uptick in her wardrobe spending. The way she'd started guarding her phone like it contained state secrets. No. This couldn't be happening. Not us. For a moment, I sat there, frozen in disbelief. But then anger surged, hot and consuming, pushing me into action. I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, leaving behind the comforting familiarity of the home we'd built together. My destination? Her office. If she wasn't at a meeting, I was going to find out where she really was. The drive to Rachel's office felt like a fever dream, every red light a taunt, every minute an eternity. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard it was a wonder it didn't crack. The city blurred around me, but my thoughts were sharp, cutting. If this was some prank, someone was about to get an earful. If it wasn't. I didn't let my mind linger there. When I reached the building, it was dark except for a single light in her corner office. Relief trickled through me. Maybe she really was working late. Maybe I'd let some insecure idiot get into my head. I parked and headed inside, determined to get answers. The elevator ride was suffocating, the hum of machinery loud in the silence. As the doors opened on her floor, I stepped out and saw something that stopped me cold. A man walked out of her office, adjusting his tie and looking way too smug for my liking. It wasn't just any man. It was Greg, her boss. "Can I help you?" he asked, feigning innocence, though his smirk said otherwise. "Where's Rachel?" I demanded, my voice low but filled with venom. He chuckled, a condescending sound that made my blood boil. "She's wrapping up. Nice of you to drop by." He started to walk past me, but I grabbed his arm. "What's going on here?" I barked. Greg raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by my confrontation. "Why don't you ask your wife?" he said, pulling free. "She's got all the answers." He strode into the elevator, leaving me standing there, rage bubbling under my skin. I stormed into Rachel's office, slamming the door open so hard it banged against the wall. She was sitting there, her hair disheveled, her blouse buttoned one notch too low, looking like a deer caught in headlights. "Mark," she stammered, her voice shaky. "What are you doing here?" "You tell me," I snapped, throwing my hands in the air. "What's Greg doing leaving your office looking like that? And who the hell called me tonight telling me you're catering to his whims?" Her face paled, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But then something in her shifted. Her expression hardened, and she crossed her arms. So, what? You're spying on me now? Checking up on me like some jealous freak? The audacity of her response floored me. Are you kidding me, Rachel? You're turning this on me? I don't have to explain myself to you, she snapped, standing up. I work hard, Mark. I'm allowed to have friends, and you're not going to police who I talk to. Friends? I laughed bitterly. Friends don't sneak out of offices looking like they just rolled out of bed. Friends don't call me, taunting me about stealing my wife. Her eyes flickered for a moment. Guilt? Fear? But then she doubled down. You're paranoid. Maybe if you spent less time at work and more time with your family, you wouldn't be so insecure. The words hit like a slap. She wasn't just deflecting, she was blaming me. For a moment, I didn't know whether to scream or laugh. That's rich, I said, my voice shaking. You've been distant for weeks, sneaking around, lying about where you are, and now you're gaslighting me? Rachel rolled her eyes, a move so dismissive it almost pushed me over the edge. I don't have time for this, she said, brushing past me. You want to play detective? Fine. But don't expect me to sit here and defend myself against your delusions. As she walked out, I was left standing in her office, the weight of her words crushing me. My heart pounded, torn between the fury of betrayal and the sinking dread that this was just the beginning. But then my eyes fell on her desk. Her phone was sitting there, unlocked, the screen glowing faintly. For a moment, I hesitated, but then the memory of Greg's smirk and that mocking phone call propelled me forward. I picked up the phone and opened her messages. What I found hit me like a freight train. Text after text between her and Greg, littered with innuendos, private jokes, and outright confessions of their affair. My chest tightened as I scrolled, every word a dagger. But one message stood out, sent just an hour ago. Can't wait for the weekend. He'll never suspect a thing. My breath caught, and my vision blurred. Whatever hope I had that this was a misunderstanding evaporated. Rachel wasn't just cheating, she was planning to take it further. I dropped the phone back on the desk, my hands trembling. The anger I felt earlier was nothing compared to the fury roaring through me now. This wasn't just betrayal. This was war. I didn't leave the office immediately. I needed a moment to let the reality sink in and formulate a plan. The messages were clear, but the part about the weekend? That struck a nerve. They were plotting to rub their little fling in my face, and that wasn't something I could let slide. I pocketed her phone. It was petty, sure, but she didn't deserve the convenience of being sneaky anymore. When I walked out of her office, Rachel was already waiting by the elevator, scrolling through her smartwatch like she had just finished a yoga class instead of dismantling our marriage. She glanced up and frowned. Mark, seriously, go home. You're making a scene. I smirked, holding up her phone. Looking for this? Her eyes widened for a split second before narrowing into a glare. Give it back, she snapped, stepping toward me. Sure, I said, tossing it in the air like a basketball. But maybe I should read a few more of Greg's love notes first. That last one about the weekend getaway? Very poetic. Her face froze, and for the first time tonight, I saw real panic. She lunged for the phone, but I stepped back, tucking it into my pocket. Don't bother, I said coldly. I already read enough. Rachel's demeanor shifted in an instant, from panic to furious. You're unbelievable, she hissed. You go through my stuff and then act like I'm the bad guy? Because you are. I shot back. You've been lying to me, sneaking around, sleeping with your boss. And now you're mad because I caught you? Her lips curled into a bitter smile. You're pathetic, Mark. You've been so checked out of this marriage, you didn't even notice I was unhappy. What did you think was going to happen? I stared at her, stunned by the venom in her words. So this is my fault? You think that justifies cheating? I don't need to justify anything, she snapped. You weren't there for me, so I found someone who was. End of story. Her words hit like a gut punch, but I refused to let her see how much it hurt. You could have talked to me, Rachel. You could have tried to fix things. But instead, you chose to destroy our family. She scoffed, rolling her eyes. Spare me the self-righteous speech. We both know this marriage has been dead for years. That did it. My vision went red. You think I'm going to let you walk away from this without consequences? I growled. Think again. She laughed, a cold, mocking sound that cut deeper than anything else. What are you going to do, Mark? Cry about it? Face it, you've already lost. Her words echoed in my mind as she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. I wanted to shout, to grab her and force her to see the damage she'd done, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Rachel had made her choice, and it wasn't me. I got back in the car, her phone still in my pocket, and drove aimlessly for a while. My mind raced, a chaotic blend of rage, heartbreak, and the burning need for retribution. But as I passed a quiet diner on the edge of town, a new idea took hold. I pulled over, grabbed her phone, and started scrolling through her contacts. I found Greg's number and hit dial. It rang twice before he answered. Rachel? What's up? It's not Rachel, I said, my voice calm but ice cold. It's her husband. There was a long pause, followed by a low chuckle. Well, this is awkward. Shouldn't you be at home, licking your wounds? You mean the wounds you and my wife inflicted? Don't flatter yourself, Greg, I replied. I'm not here to play games. What do you want? He asked, his tone cocky and dismissive. To let you know that I'm done playing the fool, I said. And if you think you're going to walk away from this scot-free, you're dead wrong. He laughed again. Oh, come on. What are you going to do, tough guy? Report me to HR? Maybe file for divorce? Go ahead. Rachel and I will still be together, and there's nothing you can do about it. Is that so? I said, a sinister edge creeping into my voice. We'll see. I hung up before he could respond, my mind already racing with possibilities. If Greg thought he was untouchable, he was about to learn otherwise. And as for Rachel? She was about to find out that I wasn't the pushover she thought I was. The rest of the night was a blur, but not because I was lost. Quite the opposite, I was sharper than ever, focused on one thing, ensuring Greg and Rachel paid for their betrayal. They thought they'd played me, but the game had only just begun. And I don't play fair. By morning, I was in my lawyer's office. Susan, a sharp, no-nonsense professional, listened intently as I laid everything out. The text messages, the call, Greg's mocking tone, and Rachel's flippant dismissal of our entire marriage. When I was done, she leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled. Well, Mark, she said, her voice cool and calculating. You've got enough here to blow up both their lives. The question is, how far are you willing to go? All the way, I said without hesitation. I want Greg to regret ever meeting Rachel. And I want her to feel every ounce of the humiliation she's put me through. Susan smiled, a cold, predatory smile that sent a chill down my spine. Good answer. Let's get to work. Step 1 was easy, documenting everything. Susan helped me gather every piece of evidence I had and file for divorce, ensuring Rachel's infidelity would be front and center. But that was just the beginning. The real fun started when I decided to use their arrogance against them. Through Rachel's phone, I discovered that their weekend getaway was set to happen at a luxury cabin upstate. The location was perfect, isolated enough for privacy but still within driving distance for a little, surprise visit. I didn't plan to confront them directly. That would be too predictable. Instead, I made a few calls. One to Greg's wife, Lisa, yes, the bastard was married, and another to a private investigator I'd hired on Susan's recommendation. The investigator would document everything, ensuring there was no way Greg or Rachel could wriggle out of the consequences. But I didn't stop there. I sent an anonymous tip to Greg's company, detailing his inappropriate relationship with an employee and providing some of the more incriminating texts as proof. By the time they reached the cabin, Greg's career would be hanging by a thread. On Saturday morning, I parked my car a mile away from the cabin and hiked through the woods, staying hidden. From a safe distance, I watched as Rachel and Greg arrived, laughing and holding hands like giddy teenagers. The sight made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to stay focused. This wasn't about emotions anymore. It was about strategy. The private investigator was already in position, capturing every stolen kiss, every whispered promise. Meanwhile, Lisa was on her way, her car tearing up the gravel road like a bat out of hell. I almost felt sorry for Greg. Almost. When Lisa arrived, she didn't bother knocking. She stormed into the cabin, her voice ringing out loud enough for me to hear even from my hiding spot. "You cheating piece of trash," she screamed. "How dare you bring her here?" There was a flurry of movement inside, Rachel's panicked voice, Greg's stammering attempts to explain. I couldn't make out the words, but the chaos was delicious. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. The investigator had it all on video, and that was enough for me. By Monday morning, the dominoes were falling fast. Greg's wife filed for divorce, taking half his assets and full custody of their kids. His company suspended him pending an internal investigation, and rumors of the scandal spread like wildfire. Rachel, for her part, was called into HR and terminated for violating company policy. Apparently, Greg wasn't the first boss she'd connected with. As for me, I was busy putting the final touches on my own revenge. Using the evidence from the private investigator, I filed for full custody of our kids, citing Rachel's recklessness and infidelity. The court sided with me, granting her limited visitation rights. She was livid, of course, but there wasn't much she could do. She'd gambled and lost. A few weeks later, I got another call from the same unknown number as before. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Well played, Mark," Greg's voice came through, bitter and angry. "You really did a number on me." "I told you there'd be consequences," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You should have thought about that before messing with my wife." "Enjoy your little victory," he spat. "But don't think this is over." I laughed. "Oh, it's over for you, Greg. You just don't know it yet." The line went dead, and I couldn't help but smile. Greg might think he could bounce back, but he'd underestimated me once already. I wasn't the man who ignored the warning signs anymore. I was someone who fought back, and I wasn't afraid to get my hands dirty. Weeks passed, and while Greg was busy trying to salvage what little was left of his life, Rachel's world was unraveling faster than even I had anticipated. Fired from her job, shunned by her friends, and stripped of custody of our kids, she was left floundering. It wasn't long before the calls started. The first one came late on a Friday night. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through Netflix, when her name lit up my screen. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. "What do you want, Rachel?" I asked, keeping my voice cold. There was a pause, followed by a sniffle. "Mark. I wanted to talk." I leaned back in my chair, feeling a strange mix of anger and pity. "Talk about what? How you threw away our marriage for some cheap thrill? Or maybe how you let our kids get dragged into your mess?" "Mark, please," she said, her voice cracking. "I made a mistake. I was I wasn't thinking clearly. I didn't mean to hurt you. I laughed, the sound bitter. Didn't mean to hurt me? You didn't just hurt me, Rachel. You destroyed everything we built together. You embarrassed me, lied to me, and made a complete fool of yourself. And now that you're suffering the consequences, you want to talk. It's not like that, she insisted, but I wasn't buying it. I've lost everything, Mark. My job, my reputation, my kids. Please, let me see them. Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the texts, the lies, and the smugness in her voice when she thought she'd gotten away with it. I'll think about it, I said curtly, before hanging up. The next morning, Rachel showed up at my house unannounced. She knocked on the door like it was still hers, but when I opened it, she wasn't the confident woman I used to know. Her makeup was smudged, her hair a mess, and her eyes puffy from crying. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling. "Please. Let me in." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Why should I?" "Because I'm still their mother," she said, her voice rising in desperation. "I know I screwed up, okay? But I love our kids, and I love you." I stared at her, stunned by her audacity. "You love me? Is that a joke? You didn't love me when you were sneaking around with Greg. You didn't love me when you let him mock me to my face." "That wasn't love," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I was angry, and I made a terrible decision. But I'm ready to make things right. Please, Mark. We can fix this." I let out a bitter laugh. "Fix this? There's no fixing what you did, Rachel. You burned the bridge, and now you're standing in the ashes asking me to rebuild it." She stepped closer, reaching for my hand, but I pulled back. "Mark, please. I'll do anything. Just let me come back. Let's try to be a family again." Before I could respond, the sound of little feet pattering on the floor caught my attention. Our daughter, Ellie, appeared behind me, clutching her stuffed bunny. "Daddy, who's that?" Rachel's face crumpled, and she knelt down. "Ellie, baby, it's Mommy." Ellie tilted her head, confused. "Mommy? Why are you crying?" My chest tightened at the sight, but I refused to let Rachel manipulate the situation. "Ellie, go back inside. I'll be there in a minute." "But Daddy." "Now, Ellie," I said, my voice firm. She pouted but shuffled back into the house. When I turned back to Rachel, her expression was a mix of heartbreak and fury. "You can't keep them away from me, Mark." "I'm not keeping them away from you," I said. "You did that to yourself." Just as Rachel opened her mouth to argue, another car pulled up to the curb. It was Greg's wife, Lisa. She stepped out, a firestorm of fury in her eyes, holding an envelope that looked ominously thick. "Rachel," Lisa called out, striding toward us with purpose. "I think we need to talk." Rachel turned to her, confusion flickering across her face. "What are you doing here?" Lisa smirked, waving the envelope. "I thought you'd want to see this. It's a copy of the lawsuit I filed against your boyfriend for misuse of marital funds. Turns out he was spending our money on you. And guess what? That makes you liable." Rachel's face turned ghostly pale. "Liable? What are you talking about?" "Oh, don't act dumb now," Lisa snapped. "Greg was using company funds and our joint accounts to fund your little rendezvous. And since you benefited from it, you're just as guilty." My jaw dropped as I pieced it together. Rachel wasn't just humiliated, she was about to be financially ruined. "You can't do this," Rachel shouted, her voice cracking. "I didn't know." "You knew enough," Lisa cut her off. "And I'll make sure the court sees it that way." Rachel turned back to me, her desperation reaching new heights. "Mark, you can't let her do this. Please, you have to help me." I stared at her, cold and unmoved. "Help you? You mean like you helped me when you destroyed our marriage?" Tears streamed down her face as she realized the gravity of her situation. For once, Rachel had no clever retort, no way to manipulate her way out of the mess she'd created. "Good luck," I said, stepping back into the house and shutting the door in her face. After shutting the door on Rachel, I leaned against it, taking a deep breath. The chaos outside, the shouting, the accusations, Lisa's fiery wrath, it felt like the final chapter of a story I didn't want to be in anymore. I wasn't just moving on emotionally, I was ready to burn the bridge entirely. Later that evening, after the kids were asleep, I received a message from an unknown number. Given the whirlwind of recent events, I almost ignored it, but something compelled me to check. The message read, "Mark, I need to talk. I know this is random, but it's about Greg and Rachel. You deserve to know everything." Curiosity piqued, I replied cautiously, "Who is this?" The response came quickly. "A former employee of Greg's. Let's just say I know things Rachel didn't want you to find out. Meet me tomorrow at the coffee spot, 10 a.m. You'll thank me later." My instinct screamed trap, but I couldn't ignore the possibility that there was more to this story. I had to know what else Rachel had been hiding. The next morning, I arrived early, taking a seat in the corner. A woman walked in, her sharp features and confident stride catching my attention. She was in her late 30s, dressed professionally, and carrying a leather satchel. She scanned the room, spotted me, and approached. "Mark?" she asked, her voice low. "That's me," I replied cautiously. "And you are?" "Call me Karen," she said, sitting down. "I used to work for Greg. Let's just say I left under difficult circumstances." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued but wary. "What does this have to do with Rachel?" Karen leaned in, her voice dropping. "Greg has a pattern. Rachel wasn't his first affair, and she won't be his last. But what's interesting is that she wasn't just his plaything, she helped him cover up some shady business dealings at the company. Embezzlement, fraud, you name it." I frowned, my mind racing. "Are you saying Rachel was involved?" Karen smirked. "Involved? She was his accomplice. I've got emails, financial records, and even recorded conversations to prove it. I've been sitting on this information, waiting for the right moment." "Why tell me now?" I asked, still skeptical. "Because Greg ruined my life," Karen said, her eyes flashing with anger. "And Rachel? She's no innocent victim. She knew exactly what she was doing. You have kids with her, Mark. You deserve to know what kind of person she really is." She slid a USB drive across the table. "Everything you need is on here. Use it however you see fit." That night, after the kids were in bed, I plugged the USB into my laptop. What I found was beyond anything I could have imagined. There were spreadsheets showing funds siphoned from company accounts, emails where Rachel and Greg discussed laundering money through fake invoices, and even voice recordings of Rachel bragging about beating the system. My stomach churned. Rachel wasn't just a cheater, she was a criminal. And she hadn't just betrayed me, she'd put our entire family at risk. I called Susan immediately. "You're not going to believe this," I said, summarizing what I'd found. Susan, ever the shark, didn't miss a beat. "We can use this, Mark. Not just in the divorce but to ensure she doesn't get away with any of it. If you're willing, we can turn this over to the authorities." The thought of Rachel in handcuffs sent a pang of guilt through me, but it was fleeting. She'd made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Susan. "The authorities acted on the evidence," she said, her tone triumphant. "They raided Greg's house and the cabin where he and Rachel had been meeting. Rachel's name came up during the interrogation. Sure enough, that evening, I saw it on the news: local CEO and employee arrested for fraud and embezzlement. There was Rachel, being led away in handcuffs, her face pale and stricken. Greg looked worse, disheveled and defeated, his cocky smirk nowhere to be found. For the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of closure. They had tried to destroy me, but in the end, they destroyed themselves. With Rachel out of the picture, life became quieter, simpler. I focused on the kids, ensuring they felt loved and secure despite everything. Therapy sessions helped me process the anger and betrayal, but more importantly, they helped me let go. One day, as I was picking Ellie up from school, another parent approached me, a single mom named Claire whose daughter was in Ellie's class. We'd spoken a few times, but nothing more. This time, she smiled warmly and said, "Hey, Mark. I was wondering if you and Ellie might like to join us for a playdate this weekend?" For the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of something I thought I'd lost: hope. It had been 3 months since the raid. Life was calmer, but Rachel wasn't entirely out of my orbit. She was in jail awaiting trial, and I hadn't heard from her directly, until one day, I got a letter. I almost threw it away. But something about the envelope, addressed in her familiar handwriting, made me open it. Inside was a short, desperate plea. "Mark. I know I don't deserve your help, but I'm begging you for the sake of our kids. Please come visit me. I have no one else. Rachel." I stared at the letter for a long time, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to leave her to rot. But another part, the one that remembered the years we spent together before she became someone I didn't recognize, couldn't ignore her completely. So, against my better judgment, I went. The visitation room was stark, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the pale walls. Rachel shuffled in, dressed in the standard issue orange jumpsuit, her face gaunt and tired. She sat down across from me, her hands trembling as she picked up the phone. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible through the glass. "Rachel," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "You wanted to see me." Tears welled in her eyes, but I wasn't moved. I'd seen this performance before. "I've made so many mistakes," she said, her voice shaking. "But I'm not a bad person. I got in over my head." I leaned forward, my expression hard. "You didn't just cheat, Rachel. You broke the law. You risked everything, our marriage, our family, our kids, for Greg. And now you want sympathy?" Her tears spilled over, but there was a flicker of defiance in her gaze. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. Greg, he manipulated me." I raised an eyebrow. "Manipulated you? Or did you just like the thrill of it? The lies, the sneaking around, the money?" She flinched, but she didn't deny it. "I know I hurt you," she said, her voice cracking. "And I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But, Mark, I need you now. I need someone to believe in me." I let out a bitter laugh. "You need me? You didn't think about that when you were plotting against me with Greg. You didn't think about it when you put our kids in jeopardy." "Mark, please," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm begging you. If you can't forgive me, at least help me see the kids. I can't do this without them." I stared at her, the woman who once meant everything to me but had become a stranger. "You don't deserve to see them, Rachel. Not yet. Maybe one day, when you've taken responsibility for what you've done. But until then, they're better off without you." Her face crumpled, and she pressed her hands to the glass, sobbing. "Mark, please. Don't take them away from me." I stood, the phone still in my hand. "You took them away from yourself, Rachel. You made your choices. Now live with them." I hung up the phone and walked out, her cries echoing behind me. That night, after putting the kids to bed, I got another letter, this one from Greg. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. It read, "Mark. You think you've won, but you haven't. Rachel and I made mistakes, sure, but you'll never have her love like I did. And when I get out, I'll make sure you never forget that. Greg." The arrogance of the man was staggering. I wanted to ignore it, but then an idea struck me, a way to not only shut Greg up for good but to ensure Rachel could never use me or the kids as leverage again. I called Susan. "I need to take this further," I told her. "I want to make sure Greg and Rachel have no way of coming back from this." "What do you have in mind?" she asked. "A little insurance policy," I said, a plan already forming. I used the evidence Karen had given me, along with new information Susan helped uncover, to file a civil suit against Greg and Rachel. It wasn't just about the money they stole, it was about ensuring they had no chance of rebuilding their lives on the backs of others. I subpoenaed their emails, their bank records, even testimony from Lisa and Karen. By the time the trial came around, the case was airtight. Greg's smirk was gone, replaced by a hollow stare. Rachel looked defeated, her once polished demeanor a shadow of its former self. The judge ruled in my favor, awarding me damages and ensuring Greg and Rachel would face steep fines and restitution payments on top of their prison sentences. But the best part? The ruling also barred Rachel from contacting the kids until she completed a strict rehabilitation program and proved she could be a fit parent. Months later, as life settled into a new normal, I found myself sitting on the back porch, watching Ellie and my son, Jake, play in the yard. Claire, the single mom I'd met, sat beside me, sipping a glass of wine. "You're quiet," she said, nudging me playfully. "Just thinking," I said, smiling. "About how far we've come." She nodded, her expression warm. "You deserve some peace, Mark. And so do those kids." As Ellie ran up to me, holding a drawing she'd made, I realized she was right. I'd fought through betrayal, heartbreak, and chaos, but I'd come out stronger. Rachel and Greg thought they'd ruined me, but in the end, they'd only set me free. Life had finally settled into something resembling normal. The kids were thriving in their routines, and I was finding peace in a life without Rachel's chaos. Claire and I were growing closer, her warmth and steadiness a stark contrast to the whirlwind of betrayal I'd endured. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. But just as I began to think the storm had passed, a final, unexpected wave crashed into my life. It happened on an otherwise quiet Saturday morning. The kids were watching cartoons, and I was flipping pancakes in the kitchen when my phone buzzed with a notification from an unknown number. I hesitated but opened it anyway. The message read, "Mark. You think it's over, but it's not. You'll regret underestimating me. G. Greg." A cold chill ran down my spine. He was in prison, how could he be contacting me? And what did he mean by, "not over"? Before I could process it, the doorbell rang. My instincts flared, and I ushered the kids into their rooms. "Stay here," I told them, trying to keep my voice calm. When I opened the door, 2 police officers stood on the porch, their expressions grim. "Mr. Bennett?" one of them asked. "Yes," I replied, my heart pounding. "We need to speak with you. It's about your ex-wife. Rachel was dead." The officers explained that she'd been found in her cell early that morning, the victim of an apparent suicide. But something about their tone suggested there was more to the story. "Is there something you're not telling me?" I asked, my voice steady despite the chaos in my mind. The younger officer hesitated, glancing at his partner. "There's a note," he said finally. "It was addressed to you." They handed me a sealed envelope. My hands shook as I opened it, revealing Rachel's familiar handwriting. The note read, "Mark. I don't expect forgiveness. I know I've ruined everything. But there's something you don't know, something I couldn't tell you before. Greg was using me, but not just for the affair. He was dangerous, Mark. He made me do things I didn't want to do, and when I tried to pull away, he threatened the kids. If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident. And if you're reading this, please, protect them. He won't stop until he gets what he wants. I'm sorry. For everything. Rachel. The room spun as I read her words. Rachel was many things, deceptive, manipulative, selfish, but this sounded different. It wasn't an excuse, it was a warning. I looked at the officers, who were waiting for my reaction. Do you believe this? I asked, holding up the note. We're investigating, the older officer said carefully. But Greg Johnson is known to have ties to some unsavory individuals. It's possible this goes deeper than we realized. I thought back to Greg's message that morning. It wasn't just a taunt, it was a threat. And if Rachel was right, my kids and I were still in danger. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions. What had Rachel gotten herself into? How deep did Greg's connections go? And most importantly, how could I protect my family? I called Susan the next morning, laying everything out. We need to dig deeper into Greg's background, I said. If he's got people on the outside, I need to know who they are. Susan didn't hesitate. I'll make some calls. But Mark, you need to be careful. If Rachel's warning was true, you could be a target. The warning proved all too real. 2 nights later, as I was driving home with the kids, a black SUV started tailing us. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but when it ran a red light to stay behind me, my instincts screamed danger. I made a quick decision, turning down a series of side streets, trying to lose them. The kids were in the back seat, wide-eyed and scared, but I kept my voice calm. It's okay, I said. Just hold on. The SUV sped up, its headlights blinding in my rearview mirror. My heart pounded as I swerved onto a highway, trying to put distance between us. Finally, I spotted a police cruiser parked at a gas station. Without thinking, I pulled in, honking wildly. The SUV slowed, then sped off, disappearing into the night. The officers approached, and I explained what had happened. They assured me they'd investigate, but I knew this wasn't over. Fueled by desperation, I decided to take matters into my own hands. With Susan's help, I hired a team of private security to watch over the kids and me. Meanwhile, I worked with Karen, Greg's former employee, to uncover more of his secrets. What we found was staggering, evidence linking Greg to a network of illicit dealings, including money laundering and blackmail. But there was one piece of information that sealed his fate, a recording of Greg admitting to orchestrating Rachel's death to silence her. Armed with the evidence, I worked with law enforcement to ensure Greg would never see the light of day again. The recording, coupled with his criminal history, earned him a life sentence without parole. His threats were over, and for the first time in months, I felt safe. Rachel's death left a complicated legacy. She had betrayed me in ways I never thought possible, but in the end, she had tried to protect our kids. At her funeral, I stood with Ellie and Jake, explaining in the simplest terms that their mother had made mistakes but loved them deeply. As we walked away from her grave, Ellie tugged on my hand. "Daddy, is everything going to be okay now?" I knelt down, looking her in the eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. Everything's going to be okay." And for the first time, I truly believed it. Life doesn't always tie up neatly, but I had found something stronger than closure: resilience. Greg was gone, Rachel's secrets were laid bare, and I was free to rebuild my life without the shadows of betrayal. As I watched Ellie and Jake run ahead, laughing in the sunlight, I felt a quiet determination settle over me. The past had tested me, but it hadn't broken me. And no matter what came next, I was ready. Because sometimes, the greatest revenge is simply living well, and refusing to let the darkness win.